Matthew 20, the first will be last, and the last will be first. In the context of the rest of the book of Matthew, this is the last of 3 chapters from Jesus' 5th sermon. And that 5th sermon, we remember, focuses on the question of life in the kingdom. How do we relate to others in the kingdom? How do those around us who are also Jesus followers relate to each other and to us? And when realities like sin happen in chapter 18, or when the question of who is part of the kingdom comes up in chapter 19, then we're asking ourselves questions about this new community, what in chapter 18 Jesus labels the church. Who is this group of people, this group of followers of Jesus Christ? In chapter 20, we're actually building on a theme that came out of chapter 19. And so you can find the topic sentence or the topic statement for chapter 20 at the very end of the previous chapter. Jesus ended his previous discussion in chapter 19 highlighting the reality that someone who pursues or seeks the kingdom for their own benefit has completely misunderstood it. Yes, he says, there will be rewards for people who have left everything to follow me. There will be rewards, but he concludes, there will also be surprises. In his final statement, many who are first will be last, and the last first. The kingdom is not a kind of calculated investment you make. I'll do these following things so that I can end up with a greater reward and a larger return on my investment in the end. That's not how it works. The kingdom is a setting where you lay down your life willingly and joyfully, give up everything. And from that you find the greatest treasure, Jesus Christ, in relationship with him. Many who are first will be last, and the last first. Now the interesting thing is you can now start walking through chapter 20. This is the end of chapter 19, kind of a topic sentence for the chapter. And as you proceed through chapter 20, you're just going to see the predominance and the repetition, the pattern of this first and last language. Beginning with the last up to the first came, those last, and down to the last worker as I give it to you. So, conclusion to that parable. The first will be last, and the last will be first, and the first last. And even later on in the same chapter, whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Let me pause and give a bit of context just for how to think about this in terms of ancient society. And it's not just ancient society, but it's societies in general. You can recognize that various societies have a kind of a social hierarchy. Well, even often in sociological studies, this is going to be diagrammed as a pyramid. So here is, quite literally, an attempt at putting out the status or the pyramid, the layers for ancient Egypt. And you can recognize on the bottom farmers and slaves, and then craftsmen, merchants, scribes, soldiers, government officials, priests, and at the very top, Pharaoh. You can do this with all different societies. So for instance, you can even do this with Japanese society, similar kind of analysis, similar kind of results. You can do this with the Indian caste system, something similar developed. And so in this case, you have specific labels, the untouchables, but then farm workers, merchants, craftsmen, king rulers, priests. And there is work done to recognize this in ancient Roman society. So this is around the period of Jesus' ministry, and this is Roman, not Jewish, but you're recognizing another kind of set of ideas and a little bit more complexity here because within the middle of it, slaves could achieve a type of significance that even might reach them, bring them all the way up into the upper class. But yes, still layers upon layers of people with different status. And all of that is fairly consistent to societies. Even societies that talk about themselves in very egalitarian ways have certain careers that have more status attached to them, and people typically want to pursue those careers because, well, this is where you gain your sense of significance. And you just recognize then, in total contrast and opposition to that, what has Jesus just declared? Jesus has just declared that he will take those pyramids, as it were, he'll take those ideas and he's going to turn them completely on their head. So that instead you're looking at something like that, or just the recognition that the status, the achieved status, your societal status is no longer the concern. The actual value, status, meaning is your relationship to him. And built upon that is the entire complete concept that at the end of the day, everything you've received is purely grace. So let me start out then with the first parable. And the first parable, you're going to hear the language of the kingdom of heaven is like. That's a very strong pattern that's going to define not just this chapter, but going beyond it as well. The kingdom of heaven is like, as an explanation, we have parables now to point us, as we've been saying, to what is life in the kingdom. What is it like? The kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out in the morning to hire laborers for the vineyard. He agrees with them for a denarius a day, and this is probably represents a fair wage of the time. And so he sends them to the vineyard. He goes out the third hour and he finds others standing idle. So you go also. And about the sixth hour, the ninth hour, the same. About the 11th hour, right at the end, he finds others standing. Why do you stand here idle all day? Implication being the day is basically finished. Well, no one's hired us. Well, you go too. Evening comes. The owner of the vineyard says to the foreman, let's call up the laborers, let's pay them their wages. And notice the language interesting, beginning with the last up to the first. So the latest laborers are brought up first. And the 11th hour laborers who worked for 1 hour receive a denarius, a full day's wage. Now, you remember the detail, beginning with the last up to the first. And so everyone else is watching this. And as they're proceeding up the line, they're thinking to themselves, I assume, something like, wow, well, if the guys that worked for 1 hour received a denarius, what am I going to get? I mean, I literally worked 12 times more than these guys. When they get to the front, each of them also received a denarius, and they're sorely disappointed. So they grumble at the master of the house. You know, they've only worked 1 hour. You made them equal to us. It's not the same. And the master's reply is so helpful. Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. I agreed with you for a denarius. That was our agreement. Take what belongs to you and go. And if I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Do you begrudge my generosity? You know, how does that work in terms of the kingdom of heaven? And I think the point of Jesus' argument is to say, we might look or might be tempted to look across and see the different sacrifices that people have made. And one person who perhaps gave up very little because he had very little to follow Jesus, and another who gave up everything to follow Jesus. And between the two of them, kind of imagine that one person ought to receive more reward because look, he gave up more. You can imagine a person who lives a dissolute life, lots of vice, and continues through his life, and at the very last moment, comes to faith, trusts in Jesus, and he's redeemed gloriously. And another person who from his earliest days has labored faithfully and sacrificially all the years of his life. And between the two of them, while this one was out partying, this one was working, and we might be tempted to look at it and say some kind of greater reward, like double the kingdom of heaven for this guy. And the argument of the parable is not to say that there will not be rewards. I think the argument of the parable is to say that in the big picture of it all, here's the simple reward that each receives. The kingdom of heaven, relationship with Jesus Christ, having Jesus as their king. That should suffice. And in that then, there is a kind of flip. The first will be last, the last will be first. Said differently, there will be surprises. Now, the interesting thing is now the connection to what immediately follows. And that might not strike us as obvious at the beginning. But this next section is Jesus talking about his suffering and his death. And let's look at that passage first and then put it in context. As Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way, I mean, they're traveling to Jerusalem. So this is in progress. See, look at where we're at. We're going up to Jerusalem. You see the path. The Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes. They will condemn him to death, deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and he will be raised on the third day. You know, there has been, as we've seen, quite a bit of prediction already up to this point. If you just look down through the passage, you see it in Matthew 16, and Jesus telling them that details such as that he will be killed and on the third day raised again. Jesus tells them in Matthew 17, the Son of Man will be raised from the dead. Chapter 17 again, the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Chapter 17 again, the Son of Man is going to be delivered. They will kill him. He will be raised on the third day. But there is something where the accumulation of those ideas, the accumulation of all of them and coming together cumulatively here, this is now the fullest, clearest statement that we've had. And in fact, this is kind of the climactic statement of the book of Matthew. This is the last major prediction passage of the book. And Jesus now is laying it all out to them in one clear statement. But you can see in what I just read a moment ago, in the pattern of repetition, it's not just that Jesus reveals it to them one time. But it's building up over and over, repeated, layer upon layer, and intentionally so that they really are not supposed to miss this. They've heard it and heard it and heard it, the sacrifice that Jesus will make. And there is a sense here that they have now finally understood it. And the reason I think I can say that is the passage that comes next. There is a kind of understanding. So the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him. This is right after the passage we just read. She came to him with her sons. Kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, "What do you want?" "Say that these two sons of mine are to sit, one on your right hand, one at your left, in your kingdom." And she's asking then for a special place of honor for these here two children. And Jesus' answer to her is, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" And they said to him, "We are able." Pause here for a second. I said a moment ago that they have a kind of understanding of what Jesus is saying. They do. The mother is at least recognizing at this point who Jesus is. I mean, she's heard and she's understood that Jesus will reign, that he will be king, that he will be king over the world. And if you just go elsewhere to some of Jesus' earlier predictions, such as in Matthew 19, you see this language. In the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. This is just a handful of verses before. This is the end of chapter 19. We are in chapter 20. She's grasped that. These two sons of mine will sit, one at your right hand, one at your left, in your kingdom. I mean, clear enough reference back to Jesus reigning in the new world in his kingdom. The intriguing thing about this conversation is though she has grasped many of the aspects of what Jesus is saying, she's missed something. She's grasped the sense, and her sons together with her have grasped the sense of Jesus' glorious reign. They just missed the suffering part. And when Jesus asks a question like, "Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" which is a common metaphor across the Old Testament pointing to suffering and difficulty, their answer, "We are able," tells you that they're completely blind to the fullness of what Jesus has said. He's going to be killed, brutally raised again. And I think that's telling you the kind of selective listening that we are prone to. The parts that we want to hear, we accept. The parts that we're uncomfortable with, we set aside. That actually fits into the rest of the discussion here. And the discussion that follows is going to be related to our earlier discussion surrounding greatness. Who is really great? And how would a person claim greatness in terms of Jesus' kingdom? Jesus' response to their request. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. You recall my earlier concept and this set of pyramids that we talked about, where you have kind of lower classes, upper classes, and so forth. And consistently, who falls on the bottom? The slaves, because they're doing all the work that no one else wants to do. And I argued then that Jesus' intention or Jesus' teaching would be to flip that on its head. And that's exactly what we're finding in this passage. Are you prepared to be like me? Are you prepared to follow me? Here's then the expectation. Become a servant. But the most striking thing about this pattern is that Jesus does not leave himself out of it. Okay, go back to my pattern just a moment ago. Another very strong pattern you have with these pyramids is that the person at the very peak of the pyramid is the emperor. I mean, it's going to sharpen down to a single point and down, in many cases, to a single individual, the pharaoh, the emperor, the one at the top of it all. And if I'm then talking about Jesus' kingdom, there is a ruler over all, and it is a single person. There is a king that reigns over everything. And yes, he is one. He is not many. But if I read carefully, Jesus Christ talks about himself also in this framework. Notice the language. Even as the Son of Man, the very tip of the pyramid, the king himself, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Now, let's talk for a moment about that phrase, because it's such a rich theological treasure of so many truths brought together in one. And I'll start out with this. If we just follow the pattern of a ransom and walk through Scripture looking at what this means, this is going to lead us to much more. Jesus Christ gave his life as a ransom for many. And I just highlighted the same word either in noun form or verb form across the Gospels and elsewhere. Jesus, the one who is to redeem or ransom Israel. Jesus who gave himself for us to ransom us, to redeem us from all lawlessness, to purify for himself a people. You were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, but continue on with the context, with the precious blood of Christ. He ransomed you. And what we're talking about here in this word ransom then is the concept of redeeming. He bought us. Redemption. We're pointing to the strong pointers to the rest of the New Testament. There's also language that we find here, the many. If you go back to the original statement, the Son of Man was poured out or became a servant for the purpose of ransoming not just a small group, but for the ransoming of the many. And again, this is a very strong biblical concept moving across the entire Bible. So we can find parallels like this, Isaiah 53. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, the spoil with the strong, because he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Daniel 12, the resurrection. Many of those who sleep in the dust shall awake. Those who turn many to righteousness will shine like the stars. Many shall purify themselves and be white and refined, culminating in this. He gives his life as a ransom for many. One more, Matthew 26, this is the Lord's Supper. And the blood of his covenant is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And I think one of the striking things about these two patterns is that in both cases, you have strong echoes of Isaiah 53. The ransom for the many, Jesus makes a payment. He pours out his life, he suffers in order to buy or to pay for or to deal with the problem of sin for the many. Jesus Christ humbles himself as a servant. And in that humility then, he shows us his greatness. Matthew 20 is going to end with one final account. And it also is striking and fits into the pattern that we've already seen. Matthew 20, verse 29, as Jesus is journeying through Jericho headed to Jerusalem, and we'll recognize later as we look at it, Jericho in geography right on the way, headed in. Jesus is entering there, a great crowd follows him, and there are two blind men sitting by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." The crowd rebuked them, telling to be silent. But they cried out all the more, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." Jesus stopped. "What do you want me to do for you?" And I think it's so beautiful because it's not hard to figure out what their need is. Jesus wants them to ask, to say their need. "Lord, let our eyes be opened." And Jesus in pity touched their eyes. Immediately they recovered their sight and followed him. And in the context of the rest of this passage, what you've got on the way to Jericho, a crowd coming, I mean, the excitement, the many, and almost the sense of a celebrity, people packing around the celebrity. He's going up to Jerusalem. This is going to be great. And here, two blind men left by the side, forgotten. We've got an illustration within the passage of the very kind of reversals we're talking about. The people that would be socially pushed away and without hope. And Jesus' response to them, stopping before them. What do you need? What do you ask? Even hear it in their words as they respond to him and reply, "Son of David, Son of David." Some of the highest words that could be given. They're connecting him to the promises of David's son who will reign forever, the King of the universe. King of the universe, will you stop for me? And he does. The first will be last, and the last will be first. Part of the beauty of this passage, then, in summary, is that the kingdom of heaven is not a kind of an accrued or achieved righteousness or dignity. One does not kind of force themselves up the pile and climb the ladder in order to get to a spot, wrestling your way through, stepping on other people's heads in order to find your way to the top of the stack so that you can achieve the kingdom of heaven or have status in the kingdom of heaven. Quite on the contrary. The first will be last, the last will be first. The one who would be great among you will be your servant. You want to enter the kingdom of heaven. You want to achieve a kind of greatness. Humble yourself. And the beauty of that, then, is that Jesus does not just give us a requirement and leave us to pursue it, but Jesus Christ himself, the Son of David, the King of the universe, the King in the kingdom, and the entire reason that the kingdom is precious. He who will make all things right, and he who will reign forever and ever as king. He himself humbles himself as servant. He leads the way even in this, that he lays down everything, telling us that to come into the kingdom, we make every sacrifice, sacrifices of honor and relationships and even wealth. We lay down everything to come. Even our King lays down everything for us. And the Son of Man himself comes not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for the many. If we would enter into the kingdom of heaven, we must do as our King has already done. And on the basis of what our King did, the ransom he made on our behalf, we enter the kingdom joyfully. Because he has made a payment for us, we hold this precious treasure in our hands. And on that basis, we set out not to be served, but to serve, to give our lives for those around us in love. And most of all, for the honor and the glory of our King, the one who made it possible for us to know him.